I froze in place as the officer shut the patrol car door, locking my son's guide dog inside. Cooper let out a confused whine, his golden fur barely visible through the tinted glass. On the front lawn, Michael sat trembling, hands outstretched, reaching into empty air where Cooper should have been. His white cane lay discarded on the grass. He was blind, helpless without his companion. And Margaret Wilson, the HOA president, stood at the edge of the driveway, arms crossed, watching the scene with smug satisfaction. It wasn't just a dog they were taking, it was my son's independence, his confidence, his eyes in a world that had turned dark. I had spent 20 years upholding federal law from the bench, ensuring justice was served, protecting the vulnerable from those who thought they could twist the rules in their favor. And now, here I was, watching my own son's rights being trampled in broad daylight. What would you do if someone tried to steal your disabled child's lifeline, and thought they could get away with it? The nightmare had started the moment we moved to Pine Grove Estates, a neighborhood that promised tree-lined streets, top-rated schools, and a tight-knit community. The real estate agent had boasted about its strong HOA leadership, which now, in hindsight, sounded less like a feature and more like a warning. But I hadn't been looking for trouble. I was a widowed father, a man trying to help his son heal after an accident stole his sight. I deliberately kept my profession private when meeting the HOA board, wanting us to be judged like any other family, not given special treatment, but certainly not targeted either. For 2 weeks, things had seemed peaceful. Then, the letter arrived, slipped under our door like a covert threat. Violation, unauthorized animal on premises. Fine, $750. Immediate removal required. The paper trembled in my hands, not from fear, but from a slow, simmering rage. Cooper wasn't a pet. He was a federally protected service animal, trained to help Michael navigate the world safely. This was not a rule we were obligated to follow. It was a blatant act of discrimination, an attempt to make our presence in this community unbearable. I scheduled a meeting with the HOA board that same evening, bringing Cooper's certification, ADA documentation, and federal law references. I expected a discussion. Maybe some resistance. But what I got was something far worse. Margaret Wilson barely glanced at the papers before sliding them back across the table with a dismissive flick of her manicured nails. "Your situation doesn't exempt you from our covenant," she said, her sharp eyes shifting toward Michael, who sat quietly beside me, Cooper resting at his feet. "Some residents find certain disabilities unsettling. The visibility of it all." I felt Michael stiffen beside me. I had seen this before, the way people pretended their prejudice was just policy. I kept my voice measured, my expression neutral, but inside, I was calculating my next move. "The Americans with Disabilities Act specifically protects service animals," I said. "Federal law supersedes HOA regulations." Margaret exchanged glances with her board members, her lips twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We've had residents try to claim special status before, Mr. Parker," she said, her tone casual, as if we were discussing a minor inconvenience. "This is an exclusive community. We have standards." One of the board members cleared his throat and muttered, "That's Judge Parker." The flicker of recognition in Margaret's face was brief, but it was there. Her gaze hardened. "Your profession doesn't grant you exemptions here. This isn't your courtroom." She leaned forward, voice dropping just enough for only me to hear. "Besides, there are plenty of communities more appropriate for people with special needs. Perhaps Pine Grove isn't the right fit for your situation." Michael whispered later that night, "Dad, why do they hate Cooper so much?" I couldn't tell him the truth, that Cooper wasn't the problem. Michael was. Or rather, in Margaret's eyes, his disability was. And I had just made a silent promise that I wasn't going to let her push us out. What followed wasn't just hostility. It was a calculated campaign of intimidation, the kind that makes people doubt themselves, second-guess their place in the world. It started small, security cameras conveniently installed facing our house, neighbors suddenly watching, phones raised when Michael and Cooper stepped outside. Then, the anonymous reports to animal control, claiming Cooper was aggressive. 3 separate complaints. All dismissed after inspectors found him to be perfectly trained. But that wasn't the point. Each visit wore Michael down a little more. Each disapproving stare made him hesitate before stepping outside. The message was clear: we don't want you here. The final blow came when Michael tried to join the neighborhood kids at the community pool. Margaret herself intervened, standing at the entrance with a fake, syrupy smile. "I'm sorry, Michael," she announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "But with your special needs, we require parental supervision at all times. Liability concerns. You understand, don't you?" Michael nodded slowly, face burning with humiliation as he turned and left. That night, he sat in silence, stroking Cooper's fur, his hands trembling slightly. "They want us gone because I'm blind, don't they?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. That night, I started gathering evidence. Every letter, every email, every fake complaint. I didn't just need to win, I needed to prove beyond any doubt what they were doing. And when they finally made their biggest mistake, when they sent the police to take Cooper away, I was going to make damn sure they regretted it. Because Margaret Wilson thought this was just about a dog. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The morning after Michael was humiliated at the pool, I found him in the kitchen, moving slowly, his hands brushing along the counter in a way that told me something was wrong. Normally, he would be up, dressed, and ready for his daily walk with Cooper before school. But today, his shoulders were tense, his movements hesitant. "I don't feel like going out today," he muttered, pressing his fingers into Cooper's fur. The golden retriever nuzzled against him, sensing his unease. I could feel my stomach tighten. That was exactly what they wanted. They weren't just trying to remove his service animal. They were breaking his spirit. But Margaret wasn't finished yet. She wanted to make sure we had no escape, no safe spaces left. I found out about her latest scheme when Michael came home from school visibly shaken. His usual route had taken him past the school administration office, where he overheard something that stopped him in his tracks. "They told me Cooper isn't allowed in the school anymore," he said, his voice thin. "Some parents complained that he might be a distraction to the other students." I immediately placed a call to the school board. The response I got was measured, professional, just vague enough to let me know they were covering something up. "We've had concerns raised by community members," the woman on the phone said. "For the safety of all students, we have to be extra cautious about service animals on campus." My grip on the phone tightened. "Let me guess. You had a meeting about this recently? One where my family wasn't invited?" There was a pause, just long enough to confirm my suspicions. Margaret had been working behind the scenes, using her influence to pressure the school into banning Cooper. And it had worked. Michael wasn't just losing his freedom in the neighborhood. He was losing it at school too. That night, I stayed up late combing through every email, every HOA regulation, every federal statute I had bookmarked. I knew this wasn't a fight I could rush. Margaret was playing a long game, wearing us down piece by piece. If I came at her too soon, she'd twist it into a narrative that we were the problem. No, I needed more. I needed undeniable proof. And then, the next phase of her attack began. It started with small, subtle sabotage. Cooper, a professionally trained guide dog, had always been steady under pressure. But lately, he was flinching at sudden noises, hesitating before stepping forward, even tensing when people walked too close. Something wasn't right. One afternoon, as Michael and Cooper navigated the sidewalk, I noticed one of the HOA landscapers standing just a few feet away. His posture was too stiff, too deliberate. And then, a tiny pebble sailed through the air, bouncing off Cooper's side. Michael didn't react, he hadn't heard it. But Cooper shuddered slightly, ears flattening against his head. The landscaper turned and walked off like nothing had happened. I felt my jaw clench. They were trying to break his training. Margaret must have realized that as long as Cooper was perfectly behaved, she had no grounds to claim he was a nuisance. So she was manufacturing the problem herself, using HOA workers to harass him during Michael's walks. And then came the fake complaints. Margaret sent out a neighborhood-wide email, claiming that multiple residents had expressed concerns about an aggressive animal. According to her, Cooper had been barking excessively, a lie. He was trained not to bark unless commanded. Urinating on people's lawns, another lie. Michael had a set routine for taking him out. Nearly causing a neighbor to trip, pure fiction. The letter ended with a thinly veiled threat: for the safety of all community members, we must be vigilant about potential dangers. If these issues persist, further action will be required. Further action. I knew exactly what that meant. Michael didn't read the email. He was already withdrawing from the world, hesitating before stepping outside, his confidence eroding day by day. I refused to let them take that from him. But Margaret wasn't done yet. Her next move was her cruelest yet. A week later, Michael decided to join the neighborhood kids at the pool again, despite what had happened last time. He was determined not to let them win. But as soon as he arrived, Margaret was already there, waiting. She didn't just block his entrance, she made a show of it. "I'm so sorry, Michael," she said loudly, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "With your special needs, we require parental supervision at all times. Liability concerns, you understand." A hush fell over the pool deck. The other kids stared. Some looked uncomfortable. Others smirked. Michael froze, his hands clenching at his sides. "You're saying he's not allowed here without me?" I asked, stepping forward. Margaret's smile sharpened. "Rules are rules." Michael didn't say a word as he turned and walked away. He didn't speak at all that evening, not even when I asked him what he wanted for dinner. Instead, he sat on the floor of his room, running his fingers over Cooper's fur in slow, repetitive strokes. I had seen this before. The way silence can swallow a person whole. That night, after he went to bed, I stayed up reviewing every letter, every fabricated complaint, every false claim Margaret had made. I created a separate folder of evidence, compiling voice recordings, emails, timestamps. I wasn't just preparing a defense. I was building a case. And I knew, without a doubt, that Margaret was planning something bigger. I just didn't realize how far she would go. When I got the call the next afternoon, Michael's panicked voice on the other end of the line, I understood. "Dad, they're here. Police and animal control. Margaret's saying Cooper attacked someone. They're taking him away." I could hear voices in the background, Margaret's sharp accusations cutting through the commotion. Cooper's confused whining. Michael's shaky breathing. And in that moment, I knew exactly what Margaret had done. She had just made her biggest mistake. The moment I heard the fear in Michael's voice, I knew I had no time to waste. I grabbed my keys and sprinted to my car, barely registering the speed limit signs as I raced home. My mind was already piecing it together. Margaret had been escalating for weeks, setting the stage for something bigger. Now, she had orchestrated her checkmate move, calling the police with a fabricated accusation, knowing I was in court and unable to intervene. As I turned onto our street, I saw the crowd, neighbors gathered on their lawns, whispering, watching. At the center of it all stood Margaret, her arms folded across her chest, addressing the officer beside the patrol car. The rear door was open, and inside, I spotted Cooper, pressed against the seat, ears pinned back in confusion. Michael was on the ground, reaching blindly for his dog, his face streaked with tears. I parked so fast my tires screeched, but I forced myself to move deliberately as I stepped out, scanning the scene with practiced control. 15 years on the federal bench had taught me the value of timing. I needed to let them show their hand before I revealed mine. Margaret's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "We've had concerns for months," she declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Just because the child is blind doesn't mean we should ignore safety risks. That dog is aggressive. He lunged at a resident's son this morning." I turned to Officer Bryant, a man in his 40s with a rigid posture that suggested he was just following orders. "Officer," I said evenly, "what exactly is the complaint here?" He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Sir, we received a report of an animal behaving aggressively toward a child. Under precautionary measures, we—" "From whom?" I interrupted. "Who made this report?" Margaret lifted her chin. "The Petersons. Their son Tommy was nearly attacked. We can't wait until an actual incident occurs before taking action." I turned to where Mrs. Peterson stood off to the side, clutching her son's shoulders. The boy, no older than 10, looked confused, shifting from foot to foot. His mother nudged him forward. "Tommy," Margaret prompted, "tell them what happened." The child hesitated. The dog looked at me." Silence. Margaret stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Tell them about the growling, dear." Tommy fidgeted. I don't think he growled." Margaret's fingers curled into fists. "Sweetheart, remember, you told me you were scared. And when a child is scared, we take it seriously, don't we?" I felt my blood go cold. She wasn't just lying. She was coaching a child to lie for her. I turned back to the officer. "And this is enough evidence to justify seizing a federally protected service animal?" A vague feeling of fear? Officer Bryant hesitated. He knew something was wrong. I could see it in the way his grip tightened around his notepad, in the way his eyes flicked toward Cooper, who remained completely still, his training overriding any confusion at the chaos around him. Margaret saw his hesitation too, and she pounced. "Rules exist for a reason," she snapped. "Special treatment leads to chaos. First dogs, then who knows what kind of people moving in next." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, conditioned to trust authority without question. Others, though, ****, I saw the first flickers of doubt, ****. That was my opening. I inhaled slowly, measured. And then, in a voice honed from years of delivering consequential rulings, I spoke. "Officer Bryant," I said, pulling out my credentials, "I have some information that will significantly change how you proceed in the next 30 seconds. Margaret scoffed. "Oh, please, you think flashing some credentials?" I stepped forward, locking eyes with the officer. "I am Judge Samuel Parker, Federal Judge of the Eastern District. That dog is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and what's happening here constitutes a civil rights violation against a disabled minor." The shift in the air was instantaneous. A murmur surged through the crowd, the weight of my title settling in. Officer Bryant visibly paled, his hand instinctively releasing his grip on his citation pad. Margaret's smug expression cracked, her carefully curated power unraveling at the seams. I wasn't done. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice carrying across the hushed street, "I have been recording and documenting this harassment campaign for the past 3 months. Today's events constitute evidence in what will become a federal civil rights violation case." Margaret staggered back, as if physically struck. You never said you were a judge," she stammered. "And you never said you were targeting my son because of his disability," I replied coldly. Yet here we are. The crowd was shifting now. Some stepped forward. Others whispered, glancing at one another, realizing they had been pawns in Margaret's war. Margaret clawed for control. "This is a private community matter. "This stopped being private," I said, cutting her off, "when you weaponized law enforcement against a blind teenager." For the first time, real fear crept into her expression. I turned back to Officer Bryant. "Would you like to reconsider your next course of action? Because I'll remind you, officer, that failure to verify a service animal status before removal is a direct ADA violation, and Pine Grove Estates is already facing multiple legal infractions." His jaw tightened. Then, in the moment that sealed Margaret's downfall, he took a step back from the patrol car and opened the door. "Judge Parker," he said, his voice professional but strained, "I'm releasing the service animal back to your son immediately." Cooper bounded out, going straight to Michael, pressing against his side. Michael buried his hands in Cooper's fur, his breath hitching in relief. Officer Bryant turned back to Margaret, who was now ashen-faced, frantically looking at her board members for support. "I'll need to file a corrected report documenting today's events," he said carefully. "And ma'am," his eyes locked onto Margaret, "I'll also need you to come to the station for a formal statement regarding today's complaint." Margaret's breath hitched. You can't be serious." "I was just." "I am serious," he said, flipping his notepad shut. "Filing a false police report is a criminal offense." And just like that, the HOA president of Pine Grove Estates was escorted to a patrol car, the very same one she had tried to use against my son. As she was driven away, I turned to the stunned crowd. "For those recording this," I said, "I encourage you to continue. Because what just happened here?" I gestured around us. "This is what discrimination looks like. It hides behind HOA rules. Behind whispers of community standards." No one spoke. But then, from the back of the crowd, a voice finally rose. "She's been doing this to a lot of us," someone murmured. I turned. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her hands trembling. "Our adopted children weren't allowed at the pool either," she said softly. Then another voice joined. "My mother's wheelchair ramp got fined daily until she stopped visiting," Mr. Rivera added. Then another. Then another. Margaret had thought she was invincible. She had no idea what she had just set in motion. The neighborhood was no longer silent. The carefully curated illusion of Pine Grove Estates had cracked, and through the widening fissures, the truth was spilling out. Margaret had spent years cultivating an image of control, a community built on exclusivity and quiet oppression, but tonight, for the first time, the voices she had silenced were rising. Neighbors who had once only whispered behind closed doors now spoke openly. The Johnsons, whose adopted children had been subtly excluded from neighborhood activities. Mr. Rivera, whose mother had been fined relentlessly for her wheelchair ramp. Mrs. Patel, whose Diwali decorations had been cited as excessive while Christmas displays twice as large had won community awards. One by one, they stepped forward, revealing how Margaret had systematically curated Pine Grove, enforcing an unspoken standard of who belonged and who didn't. Margaret, pale and visibly shaken, had been placed in the back of the police cruiser, but her battle wasn't over yet. As Officer Bryant finalized his report, I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the uneasy murmurs. "This isn't just about my son," I said. "This is about all of you." I let my gaze settle on the faces around me, watching as the weight of my words sank in. Margaret Wilson didn't just target us. She used her position to manipulate, to control, to decide, without authority, *** who was welcome here and who wasn't, ***. The shift was happening. I could see it. The slow realization from people who had once supported Margaret's rules without question, suddenly understanding that they had been complicit in something far more insidious. I turned to Officer Bryant. "I'd like to formally file a complaint," I said, reaching into my pocket. I pulled out a USB drive, holding it up for the gathering crowd to see. "This contains 3 months of evidence. Time-stamped emails. Recorded conversations. Video documentation of HOA meetings where Margaret explicitly instructed board members to find violations against specific homeowners. I have proof that multiple false complaints were filed to law enforcement. And I have more than enough documentation to prove that today's events weren't an isolated incident, they were the culmination of a long-standing pattern of harassment and civil rights violations. Margaret, still in the back of the cruiser, lurched forward. "This is outrageous," she spat. "You're twisting everything. This is a private community matter. This is my neighborhood. You have no right." I turned toward her, my expression impassive, controlled, but my voice cold enough to freeze the night air. "You weaponized law enforcement against a disabled child," I said evenly. "You systematically excluded, harassed, and penalized residents who didn't fit your mold of what Pine Grove should be. You thought the rules only applied when they benefited you." I took a deliberate step forward, ensuring she understood exactly what was happening. "But you made one critical mistake, Margaret." She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edges of her seat. "You assumed the law wouldn't apply to you." The murmurs swelled into outright conversation. More neighbors stepped forward now, emboldened by the inevitable shift in power. A former HOA board member, who had resigned a year prior, cleared his throat, looking guilty as he spoke. I left because I couldn't take it anymore," he admitted. "Margaret told us, in a closed meeting, that we needed to preserve community standards by making things difficult for families that didn't align. She never said it outright, but we all knew what she meant." Another resident spoke up, this time an older woman with silver hair and sharp, perceptive eyes. "3 years ago, I was fined for having my grandson visit more than twice a month," she said. "Margaret told me the community had a mature atmosphere to uphold, and that children visiting too frequently made the neighborhood less desirable." Then another voice. And another. The dam had broken. I turned back to Officer Bryant. "I'd like these statements recorded as well," I said. He nodded, looking as though he, too, had finally seen Margaret for what she was. "Sir, we'll take formal complaints from any resident willing to provide testimony." And just like that, Margaret Wilson's carefully constructed kingdom began to collapse. The next morning, an emergency HOA meeting was announced for that evening, called not by Margaret or her loyalists, but by the remaining board members who now realized they had a choice: try to salvage their reputations, or go down with her. By the time the sun set, the clubhouse was packed. Residents who had once avoided eye contact with us now sat together, united by a growing sense of betrayal and indignation. Margaret arrived, flanked by 2 of her staunchest allies, her composure shaken but her arrogance still intact. She took her usual place at the podium, attempting to resume control. "Today's unfortunate incident has been resolved," she began, her tone clipped. "There was a misunderstanding regarding community protocols, which Officer Bryant has since clarified." From the back of the room, the officer himself spoke. "That's not true," he said, his voice carrying through the clubhouse. "I was explicitly told to remove a dangerous animal under fabricated circumstances." Margaret's grip on the podium tightened. I didn't let the moment pass. Rising from my seat, I let the weight of the room settle around me before speaking. "This isn't about a single incident," I said. "This is about abuse of power, about a pattern of discrimination, targeting specific families, specific individuals." Margaret scoffed. "Oh, please. This neighborhood has functioned under fear and exclusion for far too long," I continued, ignoring her. "And I refuse to let that continue." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Someone stood. The Hernandez family was denied permission to build a safety fence after their toddler nearly drowned in the community pond. Another voice. Dr. Wainwright's home-based medical practice for terminal patients was nearly shut down because of parking regulations, yet a real estate office was allowed to operate out of a home without issue. More stories. More proof. Margaret's remaining supporters shrank in their seats. She had lost. The final vote was unprecedented in Pine Grove's history. A unanimous decision to dissolve the current HOA board. To freeze all funds pending legal investigation. To rebuild the HOA from the ground up. As Margaret stormed out of the clubhouse, I didn't stop her. I didn't need to. Her power was gone. And Pine Grove Estates? For the first time since we moved in, it was finally free. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Pine Grove Estates had ever seen. Without Margaret's iron grip strangling the community, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors who had spent years avoiding one another finally started talking. The clubhouse, once reserved only for approved gatherings, became a true community center. The Johnsons, whose children had been subtly excluded, formed a multicultural youth group that brought neighborhood kids together in a way that had never been allowed before. Mr. Chun, previously fined for his elaborate garden, was now hosting community gardening workshops in his backyard. The Riveras, who had once been forced to keep their wheelchair ramp hidden from sight, became organizers of a new accessibility initiative that helped make the entire neighborhood more inclusive. Even Michael, once withdrawn and hesitant to leave the house, found a new sense of purpose. With Cooper at his side, he started a youth advocacy program teaching teenagers about disability rights and how to interact with service animals. The same kids who had watched him be humiliated at the pool now listened intently as he demonstrated how Cooper guided him through the world. The fear and suspicion that Margaret had cultivated for so long were finally being replaced by understanding and acceptance. And the ultimate irony? Property values in Pine Grove Estates rose higher than ever. The neighborhood, now recognized for its inclusive community model, gained regional attention for its transformation. The very thing Margaret had feared, diversity, change, and progress, became the reason for its newfound success. As for Margaret, her real estate license was suspended pending investigation for discriminatory practices, and she was facing multiple civil suits from the families she had tormented. The last I heard, she was being forced to attend mandatory sensitivity training, a poetic consequence for a woman who had spent years treating empathy like a weakness. One evening, as I stood on our front porch, watching Michael and Cooper lead a community walk for disability awareness, I realized something. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about restoring what was broken, about giving people the chance to build something better in the wreckage of what was torn down. And as I watched my son, his confidence renewed, his step steady, I knew one thing for certain. Margaret had tried to erase us, to make us feel like we didn't belong. But in the end, it was her world that disappeared, and ours that finally took root. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.